Out of the over 200 books that Dr. McBirnie has written for the nationwide radio and publications work for the Voice of Americanism, we have brought with us 13, which we feel are very definitely books that are needed today. They're in limited number. We've made them available to you, so anytime that you'd like to stop by our booth, we'd be happy to see you. Thank you.
There has been another minor change in our program. Unfortunately, Mr. Charles Pratt, who is to be on hand this evening, has been taken ill and was not able to get to Boston. So in his place as moderator, I have undertaken the pleasant task of introducing Dr. McBirnie, which again is almost superfluous with this audience. Many of you heard him last year. Many of you are familiar with his writings and publications, his radio programs, and the various activities that he carries on. How he manages to fit them into a crowded life, I sometimes wonder, but he does, and he has found time to work with these people on their plans for what they would do here and to prepare a speech himself to bring to us. Dr. McBirnie, of course, is one of the outstanding citizens of the country. Although he was born in Canada, he has become completely American. He holds 6 degrees from various institutions of higher learning, received many honors from patriotic societies and other distinctions, especially for his work against communism. He's traveled over the world many times in order to be sure that his radio programs and books are factually sound and up to date. His main activity at the moment is the senior minister of the large United Community Church of Glendale in California. Those of you who have had the pleasure, as I have, and some of the others here, of visiting with Dr. McBirnie out there know what an effective job he has done in building up a small community church into a very important one whose importance goes far beyond the limits of his own parish. And he is a distinguished gentleman in another respect, that he derives no income from either the church or his radio program. Anything that comes in from that is donated to the organizations that he represents and with which he is working. And his factual and responsible presentation of conservatism has made him one of America's foremost platform speakers, and so it is a distinct honor to the rally to have him willing to come back a second time and bring a new message for us tonight. So I present to you Dr. William Steuart McBirnie.
On my way to this important occasion, I spent almost 3 days in Washington, D.C. I was a guest there of a number of congressmen and senators and discussed in depth with them, interrupted only by their being called to the floor for votes, because this has been one of the busiest times for the Congress that they have had in recent years. And we discussed with them questions and issues which are of interest to you. And therefore, what I have to say to you is sharpened by the experience of being with those men, those who are the conservative leaders of the Congress and the Senate. And what I have to share with you, I believe, will reflect not only much of what they believe, but will be broadened and deepened by the things that they themselves are saying. I'm speaking to you tonight on the subject, Communist Plans for World Revolutionary Conquest, Schedule 1973, with the sub-question, is the Communist Timetable still in effect? There are a great many arguments these days about what communism really is. Communism as a movement has been blurred by what I believe is a deliberate division of the communist world into sections and segments and factions because communism has long ago learned that the old military maxim, divide and conquer, is still applicable and it still works. They not only try to divide their enemies one from the other, and thus have been successful in driving a number of wedges between the nations of the free world, but they are also successful in dividing themselves so that they appear to have a division and hence are not a monolithic, frightening ogre. But I can assure you that it is by no means a settled fact that the communist world is as divided as it seems to be. It is my deepest conviction that in any emergency facing the communist world, and perhaps even in any great opportunity for advance, that it would snap together like the divided jaws of a trap. I am not at all convinced that communism is as fragmented as it apparently seeks to try to convince us that it is. You see, anytime communism is busy trying to convince you of something, and you can tell that by the numerous times that a quotation or a point of view or an idea is repeated in the communist press. Whenever you see the communists displaying something which reveals that they are anxious for you to believe it, that they're anxious for you to hear it over and over again repetitiously until it seems to be a commonly accepted maxim of truth, then beware of it. Because in all probability, they want you to believe it, for if they were really ashamed of it, they would hide it. And hence, anything you see in the press that emanates from clearly communist sources, and you hear it or read it over and over again, I would have a very grave question in my mind as to whether or not it's true. Now, we're being fed the myth that communism, because it is supposedly fragmented, is therefore less dangerous. In fact, it's hardly a danger at all in the minds of some people. And I'm going to try to define the danger that communism is as precisely as a surgeon would place the finest scalpel between the nerve endings of tissue and lay bare with precision, accuracy, responsibility, with careful, even meticulous documentation, the description of this idea that communism plans a worldwide revolution by a certain date. Now, it is no secret, and there is not a person who knows anything on earth that needs to be told that communism wants to conquer the earth. Khrushchev said it, I hope to live to be old enough to see the red flag fly over every nation on earth. Just a few weeks ago, the Communist Central Committee, meeting in Moscow, announced again that they had an undeviated devotion to the communist conquest of the world. But when this is said by the communists, most often it is discounted by the free world because it is said openly, and the free world assumes that any real plans for this, anything more than general hopes, would not dare to be so openly touted, and as a result it is discounted. Now, I'm not going to try to get into some of the old things because I did not come all the way from California to share with you the platitudes that we have heard in anti-communist rallies for the last 20 years. There's no point in that. I want to speak with you about some things that are very, very different indeed. Fresh ground that has not yet been covered, new information that is not widely known. And so I want to begin by documenting the facts about the communist plans for world revolution and introduce an idea which was well known a few years ago but seems to have been laid aside and forgotten recently, namely that the communists have both a timetable and a schedule. They are out to do it, but they are out to do it in a certain length of time. They have specific plans as to what they want to do and when they want to do it. And if I can document this for you tonight so that you will be totally convinced of it, then we will have a clear target toward which to aim, a goal toward which to shoot. I have before me a statement by Lenin in which he first uttered the idea that communism should conquer the world. Now, this statement is well known, but there's a new twist to it available to us now. Here is what Lenin said. Most of you have already memorized this. First, we will take Eastern Europe, then the masses of Asia, then we will encircle the United States, which will be the last bastion of capitalism. We will not have to attack. It will fall like an overripe fruit into our hands. Now, that statement was published by the millions of copies and widely circulated about 10 years ago. Then some left-wing columnist or journalist, I don't know who, began this idea, but he wrote, and this too was widely disseminated, that that quotation did not come from Lenin, that it had no validity, that it was not true Lenin folklore or quotation, but rather was the invention of right-wing fanatics who wanted to put those words into Lenin's mouth that they might have a bogeyman with which to scare people in the free world. And you will still hear that old canard going around, that this quotation is not genuine. I put our research team on it at the Voice of Americanism Research Headquarters, the Center for American Research and Education, and we found this quotation ourselves. And I'll give you the reference for it. You needn't write it down. You can get a copy of it in any of the books on the subject that we have here. But the point is, I am going to document this because, ladies and gentlemen, I have come here tonight, as it were, in the form of an attorney, in the role of an attorney. I wish to make a case. And my case is simply stated that the communists are not only out to conquer the world, which everybody knows, but they have a timetable. And furthermore, we better examine that timetable to see about how far along it is, about what time it is, and then we will be able to understand our task more clearly. That's a restatement of the case. Here is the documentation on the quotation from Lenin. That comes from Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 10, page 172. Now, that is the first of the quotations, the famous quotations about how communism intends to encircle the United States. We have seen that program put into practice, and I want you to see it tonight. I won't have time to document nor to detail that conquest. All I'll have time to do this evening is to simply say that I have here in my hands the communists' plans and schedule for the conquest of the United States and the world. Now, I would like you to see just how that is progressing by this quotation from U.S. News and World Report, October 9, 1967, page 42. It has to do with Cuba, and it shows you how Cuba is one step in the communist schedule. I read, Cuban-trained communists are operating all through the Western Hemisphere. There is far more than just troublemaking behind their campaign of subversion and terror. What is really involved is a long-range plan by Castro to overthrow one government after another and spread communism across Latin America. Now there you see, held up for minute inspection, a small fragment of the overall plan, and the small fragment, like a missing piece of a picture puzzle, fits precisely into the plan as we know it. I would now like you to look with me at the most important statement of the plan that has ever been made. It comes from Mao Zedong. In March of 1953, Zhou Enlai, then the foreign minister, now we believe even perhaps the ruler of Red China, for Mao Zedong has possibly passed into a state of mental confusion. We do not know that that's true, but the rumor is that it is. So leaving that aside, Zhou Enlai is still a very big man in Red China. Way back in March of 1953, he carried a letter from Mao Zedong to Stalin, who was then alive and had 2 years yet to live. This letter contained in detail Mao Zedong's program for world revolution. Not only the program, step by step, in order, but, ladies and gentlemen, the date. I shall read you a few paragraphs from it that will give you the heart of it in terms of the schedule and the date. Now remember that this was written when France was still in charge of things in Vietnam. It was still then known as French Indochina. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu was still ahead of them. The disgraceful loss of Southeast Asia in those parts of Southeast Asia that were French was yet to come. It was being challenged, that is to say, their possession or their rule was being challenged, and they were just about to be forced out. The Americans were not in. We had, at that time, I'm sure, no intentions of going in. It is all the more mysterious that Stalin was able to read from the pen of Mao Zedong something about the Americans in Vietnam way back in 1953. So I'll read you the selections from his letter, none of them taken out of context, that you may see for yourself what Mao planned and what Stalin implemented. Said Mao, "It appears now that time has come that we have to look upon Asia as our immediate goal. We will force the capitalist countries to keep on increasing defense expenses until economic collapse overtakes them. We shall give maximum assistance to our comrades and friends in Indochina. Once foreign intervention is out of the picture, vigorous propaganda, infiltration, forming united fronts with progressive elements, will accelerate the process of liberation." Now, very plainly, Mao Zedong asserts that the communists, remember he was writing to Stalin, are seeking to get foreign intervention out of Southeast Asia. And then after that, as a result of infiltration, which we have seen so much of, vigorous propaganda, forming united fronts with progressive elements, all of that would accelerate the process of what he calls liberation. Well, listen to this very carefully. In the case of India, only peaceful means should be adopted. After all, India is an Asian country, and after it has been won over, then the problems of the Philippines and the Arab countries can be easily solved by economic cooperation, alliances, united fronts, and coalitions. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that that plan has been followed to the letter. In the Arab countries particularly. Now listen again. With Asia and Africa disconnected from the capitalist countries in Europe, there will be a total economic collapse in Western Europe. Their capitulation will be a matter of course. Now he goes to Britain. Britain must be placated and convinced that the communist and capitalist countries can live in peace. Opportunities for trade will have a great influence on the British mind. Canada and South America will find themselves in a hopeless and defenseless condition. The United States must be isolated by all possible means. 20 years from now, world revolution will be an accomplished fact. Dated 1953. This letter was carried by Zhou Enlai, not mailed, not sent by diplomatic pouch, but carried to Joseph Stalin. I do not know how it fell into the hands of the then Republican Senate Majority Leader William Noland of California, but in April, on the 29th of April 1954, he, Senator Noland, inserted that letter into the congressional record. You may find it there on page 5708. Now, again, the myth and the rumor was spread abroad that this letter was not genuine. It did not contain either the authentic Mao Zedong doctrine, authentic communist plans, nor indeed was it anything else but a clever forgery in the free world. I made a special trip to Oakland, California, a few years ago. I was there to receive an honor from the Daughters of the American Revolution and their local club in Oakland. And I took advantage of the opportunity to go and personally visit ex-Senator Noland. And I said to him, this letter that has been inserted in the congressional record concerning Mao Zedong's schedule of communist conquest of the world in 20 years from 1953, which you inserted in 1954, where did you get it? He replied, Dr. McBirnie, I cannot tell you because it is an official secret how we came to get that letter, but I will tell you this. It is authentic and genuine. And ladies and gentlemen, from so distinguished a senator, I accept this as the truth, particularly when just last year I visited in Free China and was the guest of Chiang Kai-shek. I asked him about the letter, and this is what he said. Pay serious attention to Mao Zedong's program for revolution in the world. I mean, and I'm quoting exactly his words, I mean particularly the document read into the United States Senate record on April 29, 1954, for that program is being carried out. Now, I have published that statement and that interview which I had with Chiang Kai-shek. In fact, it was not given first to me. It was first revealed in an interview with U.S. News and World Report, in which Chiang said, every senator and every American congressman and every leader of opinion in America should read carefully Mao Zedong's schedule and plan for world conquest. And then he referred to it. Indeed, it is by reading that statement in U.S. News and World Report about 6 or 7 years ago that I came across the document to begin with. Then I personally validated it with both Chiang Kai-shek and Senator Noland, and I have submitted it to you tonight because it is the statement which best meets what has been happening. He said, in effect, we must begin in Southeast Asia in what we now call Vietnam, Indochina. And he said we must eliminate the French, and then we must take Africa and South America and Canada. We must surround the United States, and when the United States is surrounded and when there is economic collapse through the world as the result of armaments, as the result of wars, as the result of drying up markets and communist control or communist opposition to trading and so forth, then there will come a Great Depression, and when people are walking the streets seeking bread, there will be no trouble in a communist revolution coming in to being. The United States will fall without an invasion from abroad into our hands like a piece of overripe fruit. Now, in addition to this, we have another document of tremendous importance, one that comes from one of the worst human beings that ever lived, Stalin. I have a document which I suspect most of you have never heard of. It is carefully documented. It is written by Stalin in 1932. And as I read it to you this evening, I want you to listen to the echoes of what has been taking place in America on college campuses, among racial minorities, and all over this nation and abroad. For what you are going to hear comes from 1932, 1 year before Franklin Roosevelt became the president. It was the election of 32, indeed, in which he was elected, and then he took office in 33. The first thing that Roosevelt did was to get America off the gold standard. Just keep that as the background information that will be of great interest in just a moment as I read this statement from Stalin. It is our duty to inculcate in the minds of nations the theory of international friendship, pacifism, and disarmament. At the same time, never for one moment relaxing our efforts in the upbuilding of our own military establishment. Now, when you see young people, even among conservative families, that are very friendly toward pacifism, read them this statement by Stalin. Communism has infiltrated the pacifist movements as Stalin not only predicted but planned that it would. Our duty, he said, is to inculcate in the minds of all nations the theory of international friendship, pacifism, and disarmament, at the same time never for one moment relaxing our efforts in the upbuilding of our own military establishment. Now listen to this. I hope this causes a chill to run up your spine, because if you are thinking tonight, it will. Where a country is selected for attack, we must first set before the youth of that land a mental barrage which will forever prohibit the possibility of that youth being molded into an armed force to oppose our invading armies. In other words, the pacifist efforts, the anti-war efforts, the so-called peace efforts being now waged among the young people do not have as their origin the sincere pacifistic desire of the old-time Quakers, for example, but are being led in many, and I believe most instances, by those who simply want to weaken the ability of the United States to withstand communist conquest. Here it is from Stalin, where a country, he says, is selected for attack. We must first set before the youth of that land a mental barrage which will forever prohibit the possibility of that youth being molded into an armed force to oppose our invading armies. Not in all literature will you get a better statement of exactly what the communists are doing in the peace movement in the United States. This can be done successfully, says Stalin, through creating war horror and by teaching pacifism and non-resistance. It will be found that powerful organizations of non-communists can be created for this purpose, particularly with the aid of liberal-minded ministers, professors, and lecturers. Did he call the shots or didn't he? And that was said and printed in 1932. It sounds as if it was uttered yesterday. He went on to say, we must further atheism. We must corrupt morality, cultivate the ugly, futuristic, and aberrant in art, literature, the drama, and music. We must destroy ideals in craftsmanship and pride of workmanship. We must gradually withdraw all gold from circulation. We must set up the idea of thinking internationally so as to undermine national patriotism, weaken all government departments by corruption, ridicule all patriotic effort, and undermine all preparation for defense, and then carry out our set policy for world revolution. Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard many documents read you, but you have never heard one more important than this. It is the key to the understanding of what is taking place today. Stalin is dead. Stalinism, in terms of the terrorist activities, has been denied and supposedly abrogated by the Soviet Union, but you and I know better. Stalinism was simply another name for communism in its terroristic approach. And Stalinism is not dead. It still lives, because that which was called Stalinism in order to get rid of the guilt of all the evils that were done in Stalin's time, to divorce many of those evils from communism, as it were, to purge communism's reputation by calling all the bad things Stalinism, is of course merely a propaganda ploy of the communists, because the communists are doing every bit as many evil, wretched, horrible things in Southeast Asia today as were done in the height of so-called Stalinism. You cannot name any torture known to man that is not being perpetrated, not in the Spanish Inquisition, not in the dreadful days of Nero, not in the worst days of Hitler's concentration camps. Nothing approaches what is being done in Vietnam. I have been there 3 times in the battles with the men I know. Now, even a cursory review of conditions in the United States at the present time will reveal that these directives of Stalin are being implemented with a frightening efficiency. But I want to call your attention to perhaps the most frightening sentence in this entire statement. When a country, said Stalin, is selected for attack, etc., etc., etc. Inasmuch as you can see here, in the United States today, the implementation of all these things I read you from Stalin's directive of how world conquest for communism would be achieved, inasmuch as you can see these things today. This tells you that the United States has been selected for attack. For he said, when a country is selected for attack, then the following things will take place: pacifism, teaching non-resistance, even infiltrating and corrupting non-communist organizations for this purpose with the aid of liberal-minded ministers, professors, and lecturers, furthering atheism, corrupting morality, cultivating the ugly, etc., etc., etc. There it is, ladies and gentlemen. When a country has been selected for attack, this is what is going to happen. It is happening today. And everywhere you look in the midst of this planned corruption, subversion, and sedition, even today, without the knowledge of this document, you can see the presence of communists. Hence, it ought to follow that we have been selected for attack. Mao Zedong said it 20 years. From 1953, that means 1973. Stalin told how it would be done. Now the question, of course, comes, is the communist timetable still in effect? The answer to that is, from a detailed study of Stalin's program and a detailed study of Mao Zedong's program sent to Stalin, I'm convinced that the communist timetable is about 2 to 3 years behind schedule. I'm convinced that by 1973, conditions will not be as ripe as the communists hopefully plan. But I'm equally convinced, from seeing all aspects of this plan implemented, that there is no doubt at all but that this plan is being followed, and that the communists believe that the plan will pay off, that they honestly believe that it is the path to a communist world, and therefore a small setback here and there, an interruption of the schedule, only postpones, it does not do away. I give you an example. A few years ago, I believe it was in 1965, I was the guest of the editor of the Straits Times, the important English language paper of Singapore. He said to me at that time, when things looked very bad in Vietnam, Dr. McBirnie, we do not want to become communists. He was a Chinaman, a PhD from London University, a friend of the United States, but a thoughtful friend with an occasional criticism. And he said, in spite of the fact that we do not want to become communists, if the United States does not move more decisively in Vietnam, and if the red tide from China and furthered by a cutting edge from Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam is permitted to come south, and it seems as if communism then is the inevitable wave of the future, I want to tell you that we will make peace with Red China. We will get on board the bandwagon while it is still time, while we can still make a bargain. Now, he said if the United States would only move in Vietnam, and if somehow the other nations of Southeast Asia can be enlisted in this battle, then he said, I believe that Southeast Asia will not go communist. Well, now here we had Mao Zedong's plan, how he was going to take one country at a time, beginning with Vietnam. He's certainly been doing that by using other agents, the communists of Southeast Asia, as his Asian agents to do his work for him, so that the Chinese troops have not yet been involved themselves, except to back up with the materiel and other things the efforts of the communists in Southeast Asia. But the point is that it's communism that's advancing, whether it's Red Chinese, Cambodian, Laotian, North Vietnamese, or what have you, it is communism. Now, this editor said to me, we don't want to become communists, but we're going to get the best terms we can unless the United States does something. That was in 1965. Well, the United States did do something. We threw in more troops in South Vietnam, and this gave an added reason for the people of Southeast Asia to take part of the responsibility for their own freedom and for the defense against communism upon themselves. Shortly after that, a group of generals in Indonesia, which at that time was practically communist because it had been so badly infiltrated. The only thing which stood between a communist takeover, the actual consolidation of communism in Indonesia 5 years ago, were a few generals and a few student leaders. One night, due to the premature assassination of a general who was an anti-communist, other generals learned that they were on the purge list, and they struck back just 4 days before the communist consolidation of the revolution in Indonesia had been planned. The result was that the people of Indonesia rose, and they threw off their potential communist masters, and the result finalized in, listen to this, 750,000, 750,000 communists being killed in a counter-revolution. And for the time being, Indonesia came firmly back into the Western camp. This was due entirely to the presence of the United States in Vietnam. And for those who say that the Vietnam War has been a waste, I would agree with you, but it has been a waste mostly because we have not been willing to win. It has been a war in which we have tried to stop the enemy from winning further conquests, but have not been willing to win ourselves. In the final analysis, this is, and mark these words, destructive to the morale of the American fighting man. For if he believes that all he has to do is to keep the enemy from winning, he will fight only to that limit of his strength. And his main idea will be to survive rather than to win. But we cannot lay the blame for the misadventure in Vietnam to the GI, not even to the generals. I was in Vietnam a couple of years ago, a guest of a general on Christmas Day in his tent, and he said to me with anguish and almost tears, Dr. McBirnie, I could win this war. And he was the leading general of one of the big divisions, and I don't want to get him into trouble with his superiors by mentioning his name or the big division with which he was associated as the commander. But he said, I could win this war. And mind you, he didn't say we Americans could win the war. He said I could. In other words, his own division. But he said, I have my hands tied by Washington. They won't let me. Now, you see, you have that kind of situation existing there, trying to fight a limited war, and there is no such thing. It is a historical impossibility and a military nightmare to try to fight a war in which you do not expect to win. Nevertheless, all that aside, even the limited war that we waged was at least this much good to us. It encouraged other nations in Southeast Asia to believe that communism was not necessarily the wave of the future. One by one they began strengthening themselves until today. We can look upon the past 6 months and find a new spirit of resistance in Southeast Asia. It was in this same country of Indonesia that a conference was held within the last 4 months, in fact, in which all of the nations, including Japan, came together and laid out a new unity and a new sense of individual responsibility as they recognized the fact, as enunciated by President Nixon, that the United States was indeed going to pull its men out. And while it would keep its materiel at the disposal of the freedom-loving nations of Southeast Asia, they could no longer count on American bodies and would have to furnish the manpower themselves and find within themselves the courage of resistance. And I am happy to say to you that that spirit is now present in Southeast Asia. So the war has not been an entire loss, though it has been a very costly war indeed, and there have been many serious mistakes, and I do not altogether agree, as I'm sure you do not, with our pull-out policy. Nevertheless, in the direction that it is going, I think that it is right, though I'm going to reserve judgment, as I suspect you are, upon whether or not the finalization of it does not result in the communists taking over, because I read you again, as I read you a few moments ago, the quotation from Mao Zedong when he said, "The French and the Americans are out. Then by infiltration, intimidation, and other things, by combining forces with what he called the progressive elements," meaning communist elements. That's a communist code word meaning simply communist or pro-communist. We'll combine forces with them and we'll take over all of Southeast Asia. So therefore, the plan of Mao Zedong is plain. And if the United States pulls out precipitously, too hastily, and does not leave behind a firm strength, a built-up force, then of course Mao's plan will come to pass as he has listed it. I was a guest of the Freedom Forces in South Korea just a year ago, lecturing there to a number of their universities, and I was impressed with one fact. Just a few years ago, the American soldiers frequently referred to the South Koreans as gooks. You remember that? That was an unfortunate phrase. We never should have used it, but then you can't stop people from talking. They did not have a very high estimate of the fighting ability of the South Korean soldiers. That has been so completely reversed by the advice and help of the United States Army in South Korea, and by the determination of leaders, anti-communist leaders in South Korea themselves, that today, ladies and gentlemen, far from being gooks, far from being a poor fighting force, as they were often revealed to be in the Korean War, the Korean Army today is one of the finest in the world. In Vietnam recently, I was a guest of the leading general of these forces of South Korea that are fighting in Vietnam. And believe it or not, that army has the best record of any, including the Australians or our own. The South Koreans in Vietnam have the best record. They have never even been close to a defeat in battle. And their general is an outstanding Christian, and an outstanding anti-communist, and he said to me, Dr. McBirnie, night and day I study the writings of Mao Zedong and of Ho Chi Minh and of Stalin, so that I will know what these communists are going to do, because he said they always go by the book. And he said, when I know what they're going to do, I can anticipate it. And he said, my army of South Korea in Vietnam is the only Allied army that was not taken by surprise during the Tet Offensive. How's that? And you see, all of these factors are at least some of the profit of the American willingness to resist communism in Vietnam. I say again, I would to God we had won. If we could only have discovered among our ranks another General Patton. Another General Patton who would have cranked up his tanks and gone north until there was no more north to go to. But I'm afraid even a General Patton would have been frustrated by the policies emanating from Washington, which resulted in such inanities, absurdities, and insanities as they're not even allowing an airstrike, not a one single airstrike, unless LBJ gave the signal from Washington. That was the policy. The air commanders had to check with Washington on one airstrike even. And you can't fight a war like that. Even Patton would have perhaps been frustrated. But the point is, nevertheless, despite all of that, there have been pluses, there have been profits from the Vietnam War in terms of slowing down the communist timetable and schedule. And one can say that unless we leave too precipitously in Southeast Asia, there is a reason to believe that we have interrupted the communist timetable there. But I have a very bad feeling that we will find that once we are really out of there, then all Red China will really have to do is flex her muscle, about 20 million soldiers or so. And the other nations in Southeast Asia, without the shield of American protection, may well capitulate. And in about 3 years after we pull out, we'll be back in trouble, and this time unwilling to go back in and save them from Red China. This, I'm afraid, is going to happen because it's what the communists wrote very plainly in Mao's letter that they intend to happen. But all that, of course, is still up for question. What we can say is this: the communist timetable is underway and is not behind in most other parts of the world. It is certainly on time and on schedule in Africa. It is on time and on schedule in South America. A few years ago, I made a careful study trip into South America and came back reasonably encouraged that most of the governments whose foreign ministers or presidents I personally visited were going to resist communism. But in the interim, just a half dozen years ago since that trip, the governments have either been voted out of office and replaced with those that are more pro-communist or weaker in their attitude toward communism, or they have been superseded by revolutions, so that the situation in Latin America has never been more perilous in terms of communist penetration and success than it is tonight. There are several countries in South America that are almost ready to go communist, and we are likely to see within 1970, certainly within 1971, at least one or several of the countries of South America on the continent, mind you, not Cuba, but on the continent, become communist. For we have no communist countries in the Americas today. Only one, and that is an island, not on the continents. We have none. But we shall have one in the next 18 months, beyond any doubt. Unless things change, that's how rapidly things are moving. To the north, we have Canada with a policy of weakness toward communism that has even caused them to drop out of NATO for all practical purposes, because they simply are under the influence of a man named Trudeau, whose record in terms of looking upon communism with favor is most startling, even frightening. And we therefore have the set-up building in Canada for a capitulation. The next step will be for Canada to deny the United States the use of bases in the Arctic. So we have these situations developing, and the question therefore must come, even though the communist timetable has been interrupted, the ingredients, ladies and gentlemen, for that timetable to be fulfilled within possibly 2 or 3 years beyond the dates suggested by Mao Zedong is altogether a reasoned possibility. I want to conclude this evening by a report to you from Washington. As I went there recently, in this very week in fact, there were a number of insights that I think were gained that I'd like to share with you this evening. I asked one congressman whose voting record on the ACA scale is almost 100. I think it is 100, but I'll say almost because I'm not quite sure that it's been all that, but I think it has. He's one of the most conservative congressmen in America. I asked him a question on your behalf that is in line with what I've been talking about tonight. I've been describing to you how communism, using the plan of Stalin, has been successfully penetrating, getting into all aspects of American life, using clergymen, using young people, promoting a tremendous peace offensive within the United States, all as a part and parcel of this planned conquest of the world. And so I went to Washington to ask this question: why can we not have a sedition law, that is to say an anti-sedition law, passed by the Congress that can be and will be enforced and which the Supreme Court cannot overthrow? I will give you the answer that the congressman gave me. He said, Dr. McBirnie, the reason we cannot have such a law is simple. We have so many liberal congressmen and senators that we couldn't muster enough strength to pass such a law with the Congress constituted as it now is. The fault, he said, is therefore with the American voter. If he will elect more conservatives to Congress, we will pass such a law, and until they do, we won't. Frankly, while it was a dismaying answer, it was so transparently honest that I at least accepted that that was the honest reason for it. Goodness knows I've badgered Congress, and I've urged the listeners to my program, The Voice of Americanism, to write congressmen and ask for anti-sedition laws, and they have done so. But in spite of that, the truth of the matter is there are so many liberals in Congress who won't pass such laws, who, in other words, are, in one sense, in that way, voting for the destruction of this country by their refusal to pass such a law, because never in history has any country in the world survived the continuous attack of sedition and subversion within its own borders. No country in history has ever allowed it. For the first time in world history, a nation, a government, has stood idly by and listened to people call openly for its destruction by force and violence, and the government has done nothing but turn its face. Now, this is an incredible situation in the mightiest nation on earth, and I promise you one thing: we will not long be the mightiest nation on earth if we continue that policy. And for that reason, there remains a compelling need to elect more congressmen and more senators who are conservative, because the very destiny of this nation hangs in the balance. I then asked this question of a prominent senator, talking with him about Mao's plans for world revolution by 1973. I said, how at this stage do you feel about the situation? He replied, I am very pessimistic because things are going downhill in every direction. But he said, I'm also a little optimistic. I don't think America is so far gone that it cannot be rescued and cannot recover. But he said, I think it is going to take a little bump to bring America awake. I said, what do you mean by a bump? He said, I think we're going to have to suffer a defeat somewhere and then have it shown plainly that the policies of the liberals are so dangerous that they can result in the death of this nation, and it may take some kind of a defeat, some kind of a destruction, some kind of a massive kind of defeat somewhere in the world or within our own borders to shake this country awake. And he says, if that bump occurs and the American people find out that what we conservatives have been talking about all along is the gospel truth, then he said, we may have time yet, I hope. He said, I'm cautiously optimistic we may come to our senses in time. That's an interesting analysis, do you not think, of the conditions of the country today and of what it is going to take to awaken the American people? I said, do you have any advice for the people that are going to be in the New England rally? He said, yes, I have this advice. And I'm not using his name, but I give you my word, this was spoken to me 2 or 3 days ago in Washington by a very prominent senator whose very name you would cheer. I will only tell you that he comes from one of the Carolinas. I was his guest in the Senate dining room for lunch, and he said to me, yes, take this message to the people at the New England rally. For God's sake, elect conservative congressmen and senators, and keep on telling the people the truth. They may not even listen to you, they may appear to ignore you, but they cannot forget what you say, because history will prove you right. And one of these days, even though they have ignored and rejected what you have said, there may develop some kind of a national or international tragedy or problem or crisis, and then all of a sudden the liberal policies will be seen to be the bankrupt things they are. I said to him, Senator, what is going on in the Senate? I said, I'm very disturbed and very disquieted by the senators that seem to rejoice every time America gets a black eye. They seem to be happier when the communists win, and they seem to want to hold us back and keep us from winning. He said, yes, there are 3 or 4 senators that are extremely dangerous to the welfare of this country. He said, I have recently referred to them publicly in a speech wherein I described their actions as treasonous. I spoke to a senator from a western state. I talked with him about young people. I said, I'm very disturbed about the conditions among young people today. They seem to be going right along with Stalin's plan. He said, they certainly are, and they don't know it. He said, the problem is that the people as a whole, and young people in particular, are not hearing both sides of the questions of today. They are hearing only the left liberal side. And as a result, they think that is all there is to know. They must somehow be brought to hear the other side, and then he said there will be hope. He said, just a little while ago, I went downstairs in the Senate building and I talked to a group of young people dressed in the hippie style. They had come as war protesters, as peace demonstrators, to talk with me after my recent journey to Vietnam on behalf of the president. And he said, I was able to convert quite a few of them because they had never heard the truth, and it astonished them when they did, and a lot of them bought it. I thought that was an encouraging remark, and one that we need to use as a clue as to what we can do. One senator said to me, keep on hammering away at the task of enlightening the people, because one of these days it will pay off. That's what a conservative senator said, but I want to close tonight, not perhaps as optimistically as I have just been for the past few minutes. I want to close by saying that we have good men in Washington, and we have those that are not so good. We have those that I'm afraid are actually in the pay or control of the enemy. I'm forced to that conclusion. I'm forced to say to you that I honestly believe what I'm about to tell you that will shock you. I asked this question of a prominent congressman who was a former member of the FBI. Before he ran for the Congress, he was an FBI agent. I said to him, I want to outline to you something, and I want you to tell me if it could or couldn't happen. I said, I see so many people in the Congress and in the Senate who are apparently more anxious for the enemy to win than for America to win, who seem afraid of America's winning anything over the communists. Men like Fulbright, who write a book called The Arrogance of American Power, or something like that. He actually made a speech on it. Galbraith wrote a book on it. Anyway, the point is that you have this attitude, and I said, it seems these men are actually, some of them, more anxious for the enemy to win than for us to win, and as a result, tell me if this could happen. Now, I said, I don't have any evidence of it. All I have is the biblical injunction, by their fruits you shall know them. But I said, what would prevent a communist group, or the Communist Party, or the Communist Conspiracy, or the hidden Communist Conspiracy, or the state of mind whole hordes of communists in this nation from going into the law schools of our universities and selecting here and there young people who, or young men, let us say, who are very bright, obviously have a great future as an attorney or in law or in politics, and then converting them, selecting those that are leftist and converting them all the way into communism, or getting them into a compromising situation, maybe paying their tuition and then revealing that they have been given tuition by the Communist Party, but then given encouragement to get into practice of law and then very shortly into politics, and then for communist money to back them up through a county office and then a state office and finally all the way to the Congress of the United States or even the Senate. I said, can you tell me any reason why that couldn't happen? Congressman's mouth dropped open. Apparently he had never considered that possibility. He said to me, Dr. McBirnie, I do not know, as a former FBI agent, I do not know of any reason why that could not happen. He said, I do not know of any check that anybody, any security check that anybody runs on any candidate for office. He said, for appointees, yes, we have a very involved security check, but not for elected officials. And he said, I don't see a reason in the world why they couldn't go in, even at the age of a student, and get him in their control and then finance him step by step. He said, you know, as you think about it, I don't know of any better way for them to paralyze this nation than to get some men who may even be persuaded to look like conservatives for a while, but then under the stress of emergencies and crises where there is a tension between the forces of freedom and the force of communism, in that situation, for the man then to come out and vote for the position of the communist nations or the things that will aid communism. He said, I don't see a reason. So I went across the hill to a Senate office. I sat down with a senator, a man who is on the Armed Forces Committee of the Senate, and I said to him, now you've been in your career a general. You've been elected to high office in your state. You have sponsored other politicians, younger men, as they've come up. You're now a senator. And I outlined to him this idea, and I said, can you tell me any reason why it wouldn't work? And he looked at me and said, Dr. McBirnie, there isn't a reason in the world that would prevent that from working. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you look to me tonight to say, who are the communists in Congress, I cannot say. But I asked this senator, are there any? And he said, I do not know. But I wouldn't be at all surprised. Let me read this quotation, and we will go to our rooms. There's a biography of John Brown, the anti-slavery agitator before the Civil War. I want you to hear this. It will make you sleep uneasily tonight. It describes, I believe, the attitude that reigns in Washington today, 100 years later. After Kansas, and that was when he executed a number of unarmed pro-slavery victims who had settled in Kansas, after Kansas, Brown devoted full time to his long fantasized invasion of the South. He won financial backing from the Secret Six, a small group of upper-class Eastern abolitionists, recruited volunteers for his army, and established a provisional government for the South with himself as commander-in-chief at a meeting of Negroes and whites in Canada. It was a loosely guarded conspiracy. In 1958, War Secretary John Floyd received an anonymous warning about Brown's plot, but ignored it, thinking that, quote, a scheme of such wickedness and outrage could not be entertained by any citizens of the United States. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that is the attitude of most of the people in Washington that are not awake conservatives today. They receive these warnings. I've given them many myself, and so have you. This very conference here tonight is a warning to Washington. We are going back to our homes, and we're going to continue to warn Washington. But Washington, as it has for 100 years, will receive these warnings about the seditionists and the conspirators and ignore them, I'm afraid, thinking such a scheme of such wickedness and outrage could not possibly be entertained by any citizen of the United States. Oh, no. We fought a bloody civil war because of John Brown, so says his newest biography, and I have read you from the current edition on the newsstands in this hotel of Newsweek magazine as they reviewed his book. And I suggest to you that we had better learn this lesson from history, or we shall be, indeed are, being condemned to repeat it. I thank you, and good night.
Just want to say one or two words. Dr. McBirnie has asked me to let you know that the books which contain the statements that many of the statements that he has made tonight are available at the Voice of Americanism. One is called, they'll be at the stand outside the door. You won't have to go around to the Georgian room. One is called Red China's Secret Plans for Destroying America. The other is called Revolution by 1973. And those are available just outside the door.